Hello. On behalf of the Augusta Library, thank you for joining us for tonight's program, The Individual, the Collective, and the Crisis, Public Health in Rural Wisconsin, 1900 to Present, presented by a team of student researchers from the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire. In September, the students spoke at the 2021 Northern Great Plains History Conference, which was held at the Lismore Hotel in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. Weston Weisensel is an undergraduate student at UW-Eau Claire studying public history and broadfield social studies. Weston will graduate in spring 2022 and hopes to continue on to grad school and work as a curator or interpreter at a museum or historic site. Adler is an undergraduate public health major at UWEC. He is currently completing his senior year and will graduate in the fall 2021. Adler is interested in working as a curator or archivist, and overall is looking forward to remaining engaged in public history work after his graduation. If you have any questions regarding tonight's program, feel free to sign into the YouTube chat and you can type them in the chat box. And with that, guys, you can take it away.
All right, cool. Very happy to be here. So what this is, during this summer of 2021, we were selected for a research fellowship granted by a very generous donor to the university. And that allowed us to put together this digital exhibit along with two professors from the university, Dr. Cheryl Jimenez-Fry and Dr. Maggie Weber. And what it is a sort of, it's like a website, but it's also sort of like a museum exhibit, in that we designed it with the principles of museum design, and we sort of organized it so that as you go down the list, sort of like you would go from one exhibit to another in a museum. This is the front page of our website. You can access it at uwec.ly/rural health. So with this project, we essentially had a blank check, right, to come up with any Wisconsin historical exhibit we could put together. And obviously, since the recent COVID-19 pandemic was on everyone's minds, we thought it would be interesting to take a look at how Wisconsin has dealt with public health crises in the past, and just to see if there's anything from those experiences that we can take away, for ourselves in the present year. And we wanted to do it about rural public health in particular, because a lot of the time history that we learn about in documentaries or books talks about the urban experience, and we thought it was important to represent the rural farmers and the small, the sort of small town community that makes Wisconsin so special to us. I've actually got the website right up here, so just so you can get a better look of how it's organized. So we've got the main body text here in the middle, and then on the side, there's the different subheadings, and you can just sort of click on these and look down at the different exhibit slides and just sort of go down the list and walk through it in sort of chronological way, like you would going through an actual exhibit. So the importance in my mind of this exhibit is that it really helps us understand how problems from the past can affect us today, because pandemics, mental health, drug addiction, distrust of public health officials are all things that this exhibit has touched on, different things that have affected Wisconsin from the start of the 20th century onwards. And these are not new issues just in general. You see this picture on here on the right side is from the 1917 flu pandemic. It says, after the flu is over, after the last card is off, after all temperatures are normal, after there's no more cough, we will all look like this. For in the days of flu and the popular red tag, when temperatures were raging and backaches were the fad, we all looked like this. And I think that's really something that we can all emphasize with that sort of pandemic fatigue and that wanting to get things back to normal. One of the things we really want to get across as historians is the idea that history isn't just black and white pictures in a book or rattling off facts and dates about things that happened long before we were born. It was about people like you or me or anyone you know going through struggles that could have happened to any one of us today. And I think that's really where the importance of history as a field lies. So a traditional museum exhibit, I'm sure you've seen one of these. It looks sort of like this, where you have the different exhibit labels and you're able to walk through the exhibit in a sort of chronological order, looking at the information with pictures or maybe artifacts at the museum that are relevant to the exhibit. We made our website just like that. So you have the different panels, which often have like an image alongside them to sort of help build your understanding of the exhibit. So in a lot of ways, it came together like a traditional exhibit in a museum would, but we were also able to use the digital landscape to give it a sort of accessibility that would be more difficult in a brick and mortar museum, especially with closures and other things that might happen because of the COVID pandemic. So the process of building an exhibit was really helpful and really exciting to be a part of. Let me go back here. So it was very much a group effort. We all had to go out, find the information that was out there about our topic, and come up with a shared vision for the exhibit as a whole. This picture on the right there is a sort of draft that we were making and sharing with each other to revise as we went on. And you can see that there are sort of little notes written in the margins or questions written in the text there. We used Google Docs to work on this draft, and it was all sort of very informal. We were able to suggest edits, revisions, even rewording in real time, which was very helpful in collaborating for a project like this. Once that was acceptable, we were able to implement the actual exhibit itself in a digital software called Omeka-S. And I'll get into that a little bit later on how working in that was. This whole process was valuable for understanding how a public history project comes together, because it was something with a definite time scale, a definite scope, and a definite budget. We really learned how to stay focused and stay driven on our one thing without going down any of the dozens of side paths or rabbit holes that researching naturally leads you to. There were so many different things that I wish I could have included in this exhibit, but they just weren't on topic, or we didn't have enough time to go into them further. Overall, it was really helpful to see it as a collaborative sort of exercise. It wasn't just what one person can bring to the table, right? It's hearing the ideas everyone else puts out, working with them, coming up with new ideas based on that, and just building on what everyone else is doing to make a project really come together. And these images here are sort of what I mean about things I wish I could have kept in the exhibit. As I was reading the microfilm newspaper archives, back in like the 1950s here, this gentleman named H.V. Albrecht had a cafe which was closed because the only restroom was built by the kitchen. So guests had to walk through the kitchen to go to the bathroom, which you can imagine is a really big public health issue. In response to that, the gentleman put out all these advertisements, all these editorials in the newspaper saying, Hitler came to Eau Claire, the Board of Health is going to force you to build a public restroom. You know, all these sorts of things that are absurd to us today, but were very much in the public discourse at the time. And that stuff is hugely fascinating, but it just really didn't fit into what we were doing. So it unfortunately had to be cut out. And there's dozens of things like that, which we looked into, and we just had to sort of focus more on public health matters and pandemic issues. If we had unlimited time, you know, going into these things would definitely be something I'd love to do. But, you know, it's like what I said, we had a deadline and we only had to stay focused. So that was a big challenge of researching. Another one was trying to figure out what exactly, it's all about figuring out what we want to keep and what we want to get rid of. Because at the end of the day, we're not making like a book or a paper that's meant for an academic audience. We're trying to find out information for the general public who might not have a background in history, and we're doing our best to make it accessible so they can really enjoy it and see how these sorts of things would have affected their own communities. So a lot of the times figuring out what to keep is just as hard as figuring out what not to keep, because it all has to come together in a sort of a central thesis that we can come back to. Another issue that we had was trying to figure out our way to get through archival silences. We wanted to include the history of migrant workers who came to Wisconsin during World War II as part of something called the Bracero program, which was a way that the US government would fulfill labor shortages while we had everyone drafted and going over to World War II. Happily, we were able to get a lot of information about that in the exhibit, thanks to the help of another student from William and Mary College, who was able to sort of collaborate with us on this project. So she was able to get all that sorted out. We also wanted to find information about Native American public health in Western Wisconsin, because if you're talking about rural Wisconsin, ultimately the stories of Native American people are also part of rural Wisconsin, but we weren't able to, in our archives, find any information, or at least any significant information about public health in that era, because it just didn't get put into like mainstream archives. There was just not sort of the thing people were interested in recording or keeping at that time. Now, there are, of course, tribal historians who keep that information and have it all accessible. But unfortunately, by the time that I had sort of tracked down someone who would have been able to get that information to me, it was really late into the project and we just weren't able to implement that as thoroughly as we would have liked. So if I had a chance to do this over, that definitely would have been something to put a lot more focus on, I think. So what we have here is how we drafted the exhibit, like the general ideas and key messages we wanted to get across as we were making it. We started from the idea that the exhibit is going to be about public health in 20th century rural Wisconsin. And we wanted to expand exactly on, well, what does that mean? What is that about? So when we researched, I was given the years from 1900 to 1950, and Weston was given the years from 1950 to 2000. And we were basically just told to go nuts, research as much as we can, figure out what the important things were in those eras, and then see what sort of common threads we can find that tie everything together. The university archivist, Greg Koken, was exceptionally helpful at getting us information and resources and helping us navigate the archival system. So we were definitely indebted to him getting all that stuff, getting all that information that we could just sort through. You'll see there that we eventually settled on these key points of the individual response to public health versus the collective response to public health, which is to say, how does the community come together to help during times of crisis, or how are individual people left on their own to deal with public health? Who has access to help and healthcare during these times? And even how is public health defined? Because I'll get into this later, but the definition of what public health means and what problems it should be able to address definitely shifted over time. So yeah, that was definitely a surprising thing that we came across as we went on. And so I'm just showing this here to give you an idea of what it looks like behind the scenes. This is a shot from the website, the finished website, on how the information looks all gathered together. And this is what it looks like behind the scenes. This is the program I mentioned, Omeka S, which is this, it's used for archives, libraries, and museums for exhibits just like this one, for showing off archives they have and finding context to them in the same sort of way. So it's a little hard to parse, especially if you don't have any experience with web design. But essentially all the information was divided into these little blocks. So you have a block for a line break, you have a block for this text, and then another line break, and then that image there. So this text and this image are all right down the list, but we set it up so that they would appear like that. It took a lot of getting a handle of at first, but I think once we were able to really get into the software, it was really, we were able to use it well enough to meet our needs for this project. Let's put it at that, because it was kind of a pain to work on. I'm sure Weston can attest to that, but yeah. For me, one of the key takeaways from what I researched during the progressive era, which, if you don't know, is around the turn of the century onwards to the 1920s and the Great Depression, and how they had a much broader idea of public health than we maybe do in recent years. It was not just dealing with pandemics. This was the very first time that people really thought, well, if we try hard on nutrition, if we focus on exercise and other ways to live a healthy life, we can prevent health issues rather than trying to treat the symptoms once they've cropped up. There was a growing optimism that you really don't see in future dates, that there was an idea that with science, problems that we couldn't solve before, like preventable illness or heart disease or malnutrition or poverty, were something that experts could deal with and eradicate in the general population. So there was a real ambition in this era and faith in the idea that science could not steer you wrong. Which this era also showed why science absolutely can steer you wrong, or I guess I should say science. It's optimistic that society's ills can be solved with reform rather than just saying that it's a matter of individual responsibility. And that's the positive side of this era. They genuinely believed that alcoholism, prostitution, mental illness could all be remedied with proper policy procedures. But they often faltered by ignoring the individual behind the issue. Prohibition was a progressive era policy, and as I'm sure everyone listening to this knows, it criminalized alcohol, but it ignored alcoholics' physiological addiction to it. It ignored the fact that, people like their booze. And the end result was that illegal bootlegging skyrocketed. People who were dying or going blind off of, bathtub moonshine. Organized crime skyrocketed. And it really didn't help with alcoholism at all. And likewise, psychologists at the time thought that institutionalizing and sterilizing people we would see today as mentally ill was a humane solution to having them in the general populace, because this was sort of the idea of eugenics, which was the idea that if you sterilize bad populations, they won't spread their bad genes onto the gene pool at large, which about 20 years after, the Nazis showed us all why that was kind of not a great thing. You can see here on the bottom left here that sterilization laws were, broadly speaking, legal in a large amount of the states at the time. We can see that Wisconsin even had legal sterilization for mentally ill people. It was just the science at the time, and it was flawed and deeply harmful. Progressive era policies are pretty often harmful to minority groups as well. Reformers had the idea that these populations should assimilate into broader white society at the expense of individual cultures and their people. They had something called residential schools for Native Americans, and this is a whole big topic that really deserves its own exhibit on its own. But essentially, the idea was to eradicate the cultural identity of Native American children, as well as their religion, and sort of assimilate them into the Anglo-American sort of culture at large, which was described as killing the Indian to save the child. And recently, there's been a lot of scholarship that at these residential schools, there was horrific abuse and violence, both physical, emotional, and sexual. There was a news piece in Canada, I believe just this year, that a former residential school had about 200 bodies of children in a mass grave on its property. So this was done as a humane solution, but the human cost of it was so horrific that you almost wonder if the cure is, really worth it, right? So this was just what we saw in the progressive era as a whole. And it was something that kept repeating time and time again as I researched this era and saw what people were writing about, psychologists, doctors, and everything. And it was really hard, but it was important to put into the exhibit to show that it was a very checkered past, the progressive era. Right. I think I've gone to Weston's part of the slides. Is that right?
Yep, that's right.
Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and hand it over to you to screen share.
All right. Should be sharing now. All right, so my research focused on the latter part of the 20th century and then into the 21st century. Researched the fluoridation controversy in the 1950s and 60s when cities were trying to figure out whether or not they wanted to put fluoride in drinking water. And I also focused on the mental health crisis with farmers during the 80s and into the 20th century. I focused research on the opioid epidemic. So this project afforded me several new experiences. I had never visited an archive in person to conduct research, and it was something I'd been itching to do, and I enjoyed every minute of it. But I quickly learned that archival research has its own challenges. I learned how to navigate the Wisconsin Historical Society's collection catalog and how to request material to view in their reading room. I learned how to keep documents organized within their respective folders and boxes, and most importantly, how to keep my photos and notes that I took while at the archive organized. But then I ran into the issue that every researcher runs into, which is dealing with archival silences or simply not finding documentation that addresses the questions that you have. For part of my research, which I expanded on later, was looking at mental health of farmers in the 80s, and I spent hours looking through farm activist papers and other collections at the Historical Society, but found very little in regard to mental health or rural healthcare in general. I recognized that because of how mental health was stigmatized in the 80s, that there would not be a document that with all the answers. However, it became troublesome that I wasn't finding documentation regarding how farmers, their families, or communities were dealing with the economic situation that would provide a glimpse into their mental health. In trying to find more personal accounts of farming in the 80s, I contacted the Chippewa Valley Museum, and in their collection were audio recordings of farmers being interviewed about their lives as farmers. The majority of those interviews would have been farming during the 80s, but out of the 10 or so interviews available, none of them spoke directly on any hardships experienced during the 80s, and one farmer even spoke on how he was able to expand his farm during the 80s as well. And again, I felt like I was at a dead end because we knew that there was a mental health crisis going on, and I think the PBS in Iowa did a documentary on it, but we're focusing on Wisconsin, and I couldn't find anything specific on Wisconsin farmers. So I went back to searching through the Wisconsin Historical Society's collections catalog to see if there was something that I hadn't looked at yet. And eventually I found the David R. Obey Papers collection. And in its contents, I saw folders labeled Farm Financial Assistant, Developing Farm Programs, Farmer Stress Assistance, and Mental Health. I thought I found a goldmine of information, but instead of trying to have like the 30 odd boxes that I wanted to look at sent to Madison, I drove up to Stevens Point where the Obey collection was kept to take a look. And after searching through a mountain of material, I came away with nothing more than a pamphlet that outlined a stress hotline for farmers to call. And this wasn't the first time I'd found information regarding stress hotlines, and we were beginning to piece things together from that. Eventually, I was able to visit the Chippewa Valley Museum in person, which has a permanent farm life exhibit, to take a look at the material used in the creation of that exhibit. From what I found at this archive, we were able to weave a clearer picture of how farmers were personally dealing and how their communities dealt with the stress of being forced out of their livelihoods and the change in their identities. Between 1978 and 1992, Wisconsin lost 8,546 farms as operations big and small were overwhelmed by debt. With the grain embargo against the Soviet Union, increased inflation, and other economic pressures, farmers found themselves with fewer markets and were unable to secure loans needed to keep their operations running. Facing bankruptcy or the reality of having to sell everything that represented both their livelihoods and their identities put immense stress on farmers, their families, and their communities. And farmers had few options to deal with this profound stress, anxiety, and depression caused by this economic crisis. State and federal governments proved hesitant to provide meaningful assistance, and what became an economic crisis quickly evolved into a mental health one. A 1985 study found that suicide rates for farmers were twice as high as those outside their profession. And farmers over the age of 65 had a suicide rate 3 to 4 times that of the non-farming population. Rural communities did not have the infrastructure in place to deal with mental health issues. And often, local clergy would be the only community members farmers felt comfortable approaching for help, and pastors attempted to fill in the void left by a lack of public health infrastructure. In the face of indifference to the crisis from state and federal officials, local communities use religion as a strong outlet for farmers desperate for help. One brochure I found at the Wisconsin Historical Society titled "The Rural Crisis and the Church and Ministry," written in January of 1985, outlined the short and long-term goals the church had for supporting rural communities and the resources available through the church for farmers to take advantage of. Religion proved to be such a substantial support that in July 1988, 250 people attended a Catholic Mass held at an alfalfa field in Stanley, Wisconsin. There, farmer Donald Schiesel summed up the helplessness he and so many others felt, noting, "The Mass cannot do any harm. We had tried everything else." But it wasn't only religion that farmers used as a means of support. In an interview with the Lutheran Standard, farmer Douglas Harsh discussed the heartbreak and trauma of being forced to sell his 1,100-acre farm. Harsh admitted to being so depressed that he verbally abused his family. But after attending a rally in Mondovi, Wisconsin, where local farmers organized to confront officials of a lending agency, Harsh discovered that he was not alone in his struggles and losing his farm was not a personal failure. Harsh was moved to become an activist, and his work brought awareness to politicians on the farm crisis, as well as established stress hotlines providing farmers counseling for stress issues. In a 1988 Country Today article, news writer Phil Tremblay wrote an article acknowledging that mental health professionals were seeing higher stress rates in farmers and promoted a phone hotline for farmers to call. But if the farm crisis brought communities together, the fluoridation could be described as tearing apart some communities. In my research on fluoridation in Wisconsin, I was lucky enough to find a great deal of information in the collection of dentist John Freisch at the Wisconsin Historical Society, as well as online newspaper archives. But that is not to say it didn't have its own challenges. Many of the documents in the collection contain nothing more than research data, which made very little sense until supporting documents were found that explained what the numbers all meant. Freisch conducted a survey in 1947 of Madison well water before fluoridation and one after fluoridation in 1951, documenting its effects on children's dental health. The study found that dental decay went down 73% with fluoridation, and Freisch was focusing on children because fluoride can only improve dental health at young ages. During this time in America, cities in most states were considering adding fluoride to their water systems, and Freisch quickly became a strong proponent in fluoridation and traveled all over the state promoting it. However, people remained leery of fluoridation. Despite overwhelming evidence of the positive effects on dental health, members of the public and city officials remained skeptical. In La Crosse, it took years for the city council to decide on fluoridation and ultimately implemented it in 1953. And almost immediately, the decision caused public outrage, and a referendum in 1954 overwhelmingly rejected fluoridation. Many over-exaggerated the dangers that fluoride had. In letters to the editor of the La Crosse Tribune, readers voiced concern that fluoride is harmful in large, concentrated dosages, and incited fear that a mechanical failure would lead to mass poisoning. Others pointed out how fluoride was prohibited being fed to livestock, so how could it be fit for humans? Some residents questioned the legality for a municipality that had to add fluoride to water altogether. But it did not end there. Local anti-fluoridation groups spread conspiracy theories proclaiming fluoride a deadly poison and a communist plot aimed at making children slaves of Russia. But by the 70s, folks with medical degrees started making claims of a connection between fluoride and cancer. But despite these claims being resoundingly debunked by the scientific community, conspiracy theories have lingered. And as recently as 2018 in Lake Delton, Wisconsin, they chose to discontinue fluoridation, and this decision was widely criticized by local dentists. Next was my research on how the opioid crisis affected Wisconsin, and this topic had me shift gears a bit because unlike the previous two, this is recent enough to where there aren't any documents in an archive documenting it, and the most challenging aspect of this research was finding out how the healthcare system reacted to the crisis and how the treatment options were made available to those who lived in rural communities where resources for drug addictions are sometimes non-existent. Starting in the 80s, pharmaceutical companies began heavily marketing opiates such as Oxycontin and Vicodin in record amounts for chronic pain. These companies focused more on profits than the dangers of these drugs, effectively downplaying the profound risk they pose to individual and public health. As a class of drugs derived from opium, a heavily addictive substance from the opium poppy, and the key ingredients to drugs like morphine and heroin, opiates proved highly addictive. By the early 2000s, soaring rates of opiate overdoses made the crisis impossible to ignore, and rural counties in the Midwest saw a 1,600% increase in opiate usage in the past 2 decades. And since the early 2000s, opiate mortality increased 577% in Wisconsin. Rural communities face greater challenges due to the lack of healthcare options for drug addiction and mental health issues. For example, lack of access to healthcare led to an increase in drug diversion or family members passing someone else an unused prescription. In addition, a major reason for opiate use in rural areas is a lack of economic opportunity. Simply put, many people lack sufficient economic means, a living wage, or the opportunity to leave, and opiate usage became an attractive coping mechanism. Compounding this is the fact that opioid addiction is not widely seen as a public health crisis until recently. By the mid-2010s, local communities and law enforcement began advocating for a change. In Douglas County, police organized a public discussion on opiate abuse and treatment options. During a 2016 meeting, one parent described her struggle taking care of her drug-addicted son. And she said, I love my son and I will never get up. He knows that, but I need help too, she said. The chaos, the dysfunction, the hurt, the worry, it became too much to bear. Unfortunately, due to inadequate access to health services, many addicts can only detox while in county jail. In 2016, former Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker labeled the opioid crisis as an epidemic and created a task force to focus on the devastating impact of opioid abuse and the need for more treatment solutions. The task force noted a 12% decrease in opiate prescriptions across the state, but failed to mention the use of street drugs. Regardless of local, state, or federal actions to help drug addiction, overdose deaths are still on the rise in Wisconsin and the country as a whole. With significant media and political attention, doctors have begun to limit opioid prescriptions. The public now understands the dangers of prescription opiates and are more likely to seek help from medical professionals for addiction. At the same time, stricter access to prescription opiates has led to a surge in heroin use, and those who become addicted to opiates seek relief. Overdoses from heroin continue to rise in Wisconsin, and rural clinics still lack the resources to treat these addictions. So after all this research and writing, we had to create our museum exhibit using Omeka S, which was a program I'd never used before. And I would hazard to say that Omeka isn't intuitive, but with the help of our university archivist, Greg Koken, we were able to get our bearings and learn why Omeka operates the way that it does. And perhaps the most infuriating part for me was trying to add images to the exhibit. If I counted correctly, it took 20 clicks of the mouse going through several different pages and menus to upload a single image. That's not exactly a no-brainer sort of thing to be doing. And the most exhausting part of creating our exhibit was the editing. We picked through our panels as if with the tweezers, picking out all the unnecessary phrases and information to the point where I wondered if what I'd written still had any meaning left at all. But I'm thankful for the opportunity to be a part of this museum exhibit, and it certainly made me feel confident that I would enjoy a career path where I could be involved in more projects like this. Then on the PowerPoint, this is Dr. Fry's stuff.
The thing is, she didn't have any notes here, so yeah. I think we're just gonna have to wing it a bit. This sort of went into more about the Bracero program and how we were able to get Michaela to help us with that. Mm-hmm. She was a graduate from Villanova and then a PhD student at William & Mary. And there was I wish Professor Fry was here because she knows the specifics. She was the one coordinating it.
No, Michaela was working on a separate project documenting migrant workers working on farms in Western Wisconsin, and this documenting how they were dealing with COVID, which is kind of how Michaela got roped into our project.
Right. She was, I believe, translating interviews with them from Spanish to English. And yeah. So yeah, it was really helpful having her on and being able to add that extra bit of context to the exhibit that personally I had no idea about any of this stuff. So it was, it was fascinating. We've got some more slides, I think, if we want to.
You talked about archival silences, which I think this slide is mostly about addressing silences in relation to Latin American farm workers, which, you probably guessed it by now. There's not a lot of archival material documenting migrant workers and their experiences, be it now during COVID or if it was 50 years ago or during World War II. And then, this is interpreting an ongoing crisis. So just kind of how our research connected with COVID-19.
And yeah, it was just sort of concluding it by saying, this is still an ongoing thing. These struggles that people dealt with in the past are being reflected in what we're dealing with now.
Mhm.
Um, that you can't really see it on that chart at the bottom, but that's actually an updating graph of the confirmed COVID death rate. Um, so that's one of the reasons why building a digital exhibit was helpful for us, because including that in a physical exhibit would have been pretty difficult. Um, so this can really, moving forward, this exhibit can still be relevant even in the future. Professor Fry had some ideas actually about it, about this exhibit being the start of a larger sort of thing like this for the university, where we could document things like this in our community
Mhm.
in this same sort of format, and really, yeah, no, go on.
Oh yeah, no, I was just gonna say, because there's some of the topics that we wanted to expand on, like really including a Native American point of view in our exhibit was something that if we had more time, we could have done more with. But Dr. Fry uh, wants our exhibit to be expanded on by other students who will have the time to like go into archives and like find the information about like how did Native Americans deal with the Spanish flu and other health crises when we weren't able to get those resources in time.
Um, just to wrap it up, I suppose, I'm really happy we got the opportunity to do this. I don't know how we would have been able to do it without this grant by a donor.
Hmm.
Um, in fact, this project was created because the donor gave the grant, and they thought, well, let's do this. It's something really worthwhile to do. And yeah, it was a learning experience, and it felt good to be able to do something that is so um, related to communities that we both grew up in.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, so all in all, it was an awesome experience.
Thank you both. I appreciate you taking the time to talk with us tonight and share about your exhibit. And again, we will post that link in the YouTube chat so that people can view the digital exhibit. Thank you so much. Have a great evening.
Yeah, take care.